Welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cressida Ryan of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford University. Dr. Ryan, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Now, today we're going to be talking about the Reformation and language, because the Reformation wasn't just a religious enterprise, it was a linguistic enterprise as well, in which translation, in particular translations of the Bible, played a central role. We're going to be looking at the Protestant side of the Reformation, and in particular Martin Luther and his fellow German reformer, Philip Melanchthon. Now, Luther is famous as a translator, isn't he? He wrote the first translation of the Bible in German.
Absolutely, yes. And it's that vernacular that he's best known for.
And the Bible of Luther occupies the same sort of space in German culture, I believe, as the King James Bible occupies in English-speaking culture.
Yes, it's a very important text, but not the first version of the Bible that he put together. He'd already translated it into Latin as a kind of juvenile first endeavour, which came out in 1518.
And that was done, am I right, in collaboration with Philip Melanchthon?
It's very early on in his career, and he's picking up more work with Melanchthon later on, but it is the same year as Melanchthon's textbook first comes out. So it does look like there has to be some kind of relationship between the two, even at that early stage.
Okay, before going any further, who was Philip Melanchthon?
Philip Melanchthon is often called the Praeceptor Germaniae. He is an academic. He goes to university very young. He's born as Philip Schwarzert, but he Hellenizes that. He's such a fan of Greek that he Hellenized that to Melanchthon. And he flies through the ranks of the universities, becoming professor at Wittenberg. And that's where he meets Luther and becomes a systematic theologian, an intellectual leader, and somebody who's redesigning German university systems. So he's responsible for a lot of the work underpinning the Augsburg Confession, but he's also responsible for rewriting the syllabus at places like Wittenberg. He also goes through the universities of Heidelberg and Tübingen, where he also does quite a lot of work on reforming the syllabus. Melanchthon's got quite strong views on how to learn Greek and the importance of learning Greek and indeed Hebrew for theology. And he does give Luther quite a lot of help in working out how to approach translation.
He wrote a textbook on Greek, didn't he? The Greek grammar.
The Grammatica Graeca. Well, it's given that title when it's revised in 1527, but it's first published in 1518 and is there as a handbook to give a new German version of Greek grammars that were beginning to come up through Europe for the time.
Okay. And so Luther is assisted in learning Greek by Melanchthon.
Yes.
And they both read the Bible in Greek through the lens of the classical Greek writers.
That's what it looks like. If you look at something like Melanchthon's textbook, standardly textbooks are drawing their exemplar from either the Bible or the Catechism, but Melanchthon sees a unity of purpose in classical literature, beginning with Homer and moving on through to those Christian sources, because he sees people like Homer providing a model of upright living and an inspiration to virtue. So the Grammatica Graeca has got a huge range of authors, 52 different authors mentioned, that go right from Homer through to church texts.
It sounds like, far from being a new Protestant form of scholarship, this actually draws on Renaissance Catholic interest in the ancient writers.
Yes, and that's where Melanchthon has to be quite clever, that he's creating something for Germany that is not Catholic, that allows there to be a new version of learning things, because we're trying to create a way of learning language that is both drawing on the same materials and making use of the same ideas, but repurposing it for its new context.
Okay. Melanchthon, as well as seeing classical literature generally as an important source, he saw Greek tragedy, didn't he, in particular, as having moral significance?
He does, yes. The introduction to this comes in a slightly unlikely location. It's in the preface to his edition of Terence in 1545, where he writes Cohortatio ad legendas tragedias et comedias. So he puts tragedy and comedy together and talks about the value of both. But the first third of that text discusses the benefits of tragedy, because he thinks it's useful in reforming men's morals by demonstrating what happens to those who act wickedly. So drama is a way of demonstrating, Greek drama is a way of demonstrating what can go wrong. But he's also a pedagogue at heart, and drama forms quite an essential part of his teaching method. So when he's teaching Greek in the German universities and reforming the German syllabus, he sets up drama as a foundational thing, and he's well known for having his students engage in drama in a practical sense. So it's both the morals of the text, but also the form of the learning that is very much an engaged and active form of learning.
Okay. Going back to Terence. Terence, as our listeners may be aware, was a comic poet, wasn't he, in ancient Rome?
Yes, so Terence, Roman comedy, but a lot of the plays Romanize the themes that you find in Greek comedies. So you have got a relationship between the two, which does make it slightly unusual that it's Greek tragedy that appears in your commentary to Roman comedy, but Melanchthon draws the two together in that short text. I suppose it depends what you mean by comedy as well. The comedies that you get in Latin and Greek, they are partly farcical if you think of Aristophanes, but with Terence you're looking much more at situational comedies that deal with unraveling complex situations. So they are potentially moralizing and life discussing rather than either bawdy or slapstick as a necessary thing in comparison with, say, Plautus.
So it's like Shakespeare's comedies. They're not necessarily rib tickling.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. With regard to the Latin translation of the Bible that Luther and Melanchthon produced, in what ways did the classical legacy influence that? Because Luther and Melanchthon would have been trying to get away, wouldn't they, from the Catholic tradition of the Latin Bible, the Vulgate and so on?
Yes, so this is a slightly roundabout part of how I've got to thinking about what I'm thinking about. Drama is forming part of their educational landscape, and they are clearly reading Greek drama and translating it into Latin. And reading those Latin translations of Greek drama that come out of Melanchthon and Luther's circle, I began to notice that they looked very different to the Latin translations of Greek drama that came out in other parts of Europe. And if you read the two together, so the translations of Greek drama into Latin against the New Testament in Latin, I began to see some echoes of word building and world building. So back in the 15th century, Valler had argued for the weakness of the Vulgate and for a return to Greek. And he believed that human culture, Christianity, and Latin were coterminous, allowing for a dialogue between the different literatures and the languages involved. So Valler argued that the Vulgate's Latin should correspond to the New Testament's Greek in register and meaning, in less of an adverbum manner than it did. So Valler was very unhappy with the Vulgate, and he saw Latin as an instrument of reform and the New Testament as somewhere where that reform could be carried out. Luther's aware of Valler's notes, we know that, and he seems to have taken up that rallying cry and gone, okay, well, I need a world view that is Latin that's not Catholic. So I need to build a lexical world in particular where I can talk about themes that are really important to Reformation theology without sounding Catholic. And I think what I saw when I was reading the New Testament alongside Greek drama was that they used Greek drama to build that world, to test it out, to work out where its boundaries are, to come up with integrated lexical approaches to topics that can then be transferred and taken into translating the Bible. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about what happens with themes like morality and leadership, which are, of course, two of the big Reformation ideas.
Okay. I'm going to say for the benefit of the listeners that there were three great Greek tragic poets. There was Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. That's roughly in chronological order. And Melanchthon engaged with all of those, but particularly Sophocles and Euripides, didn't he?
Yes. So I mentioned the cohortatio that he appended to his Terence. And in that text, the story of Oedipus is brought up. Now, people might immediately assume that if it's Oedipus, it's got to be what Aristotle tells us about Oedipus as the perfect Sophoclean tragedy. But actually, when Melanchthon talks about Oedipus, he refers to the characters Jocasta, Polynices, and Eteocles. And they only appear in that framework in Euripides' play Phoenician Women. So it's actually Euripides that Melanchthon is thinking about in the context of Oedipus and not Sophocles. And it's a great reminder that we've got to read these texts taking away the lens of Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy that has coloured our thinking about tragedy so much since the mid-16th century.
But Melanchthon did engage with Sophocles, didn't he? How does that show itself?
We've got most information about his views on Sophocles because he's got this lecture on the Electra where we can read what he thinks about. But one of our great sources is the Corpus Reformatorium, where they are constantly quoting Greek texts, and you can track his quotations of Sophocles and Euripides and indeed Aeschylus and look at how they are writing to each other and using quotations to structure letters between all the different members of the cohort.
Okay, just to cover off one point here. The Corpus Reformatorium, that's the great German edition of the Reformers' writings, isn't it?
Yes, a huge multi-volume set of writings that cover German, Latin and Greek correspondence between them. Some volumes have been digitized, which makes them very easy to access. Unfortunately, many volumes haven't been, which can lead to an awful lot of scouring large texts in a rare books room. But the digital volumes make it an accessible body of text for anyone who's interested to go and have a look at.
It's one of those great monuments to 19th century German scholarship.
It's extraordinary. Individual texts can be 1,000 pages. And in volume 7, for example, there are 11 references to Sophocles in over 1,000 pages of text. So when we're looking at this material, we're looking at a huge amount of material. These men are writing enormous quantities of text. They're thinking very hard about an awful lot of subjects. And the Corpus Reformatorium brings together a lot of those themes in multiple languages, but also, of course, in multiple scripts. So if you are going to try and read the German, you are faced with the challenge of the script.
Yeah.
The Corpus Reformatorium is absolutely fascinating. I have some concerns about using the Corpus Reformatorium's quotations too strongly. They're not always entirely concerned by who the quotation's from. So there is one quotation that they bandy around between them that variously gets attributed to both Sophocles and Euripides. So although there is a clear split between Sophocles and Euripides, it's not 100% clear that they always cared about that split.
Yeah. Going back to something you mentioned earlier, Melanchthon and others were producing translations of these Greek texts into Latin, weren't they? Melanchthon produced, I think, Latin translations of Euripides' plays.
Yes, and this goes back to what I was saying about his students putting on plays, well, certainly using drama as part of their studies. So in the library at Wittenberg, you've got Aeschylus and Euripides. You haven't actually got Sophocles. So when Melanchthon's using Sophocles, he's got to be accessing the text through private sources. It's not in the library. And he does a complete Latin translation of the plays of Euripides, which are not read much nowadays, but have been published in 1834. So you can get them as rare books. And he's very keen on thinking about Euripides as the best person at Greek who can express virtues.
That's Euripides as a moral teacher, because he's often thought of today as something of a subversive, isn't he?
Well, indeed, but Melanchthon looks at the Electra story, for example, and he sees in that story, in both the Sophocles version and in the Euripides version, elements of philostorgia for a father. So a form of love that is very important, the storge, that is an important form of love in Christianity. He sees that in the Electra story and therefore can make a positive virtue out of the Euripides play, even though the Euripides play is perhaps not thought of as something nowadays that would be a great model for virtue.
Okay, well, we've touched on Luther and Melanchthon. There were also two other associates of Melanchthon who were active in this period, weren't there? There was Lonecker and Camerarius.
So Johann Lonecker and Joachim Camerarius are the two members of that group who are most actively working on drama. Melanchthon, we know that he's interested in drama, but he's also got a sidekick, I suppose, to start off with, Camerarius, who goes on to publish something along the lines of 150 books. He's a hugely prolific writer, and he gains the title Polyhistor. So Camerarius is Melanchthon's protege, and he supports Melanchthon on the Augsburg Confession, and Melanchthon places him in a university position as well, where he's able to continue reforming the syllabus. So Camerarius and Melanchthon are very closely linked as allies, as collaborators, as a kind of master and apprentice, I think, type model, it feels to me, although Camerarius ends up hugely successful in his own right. Lonecker's a little older and a little less well known. He has to flee to Strasbourg in 1523 because he's fallen foul of the authorities. And it's in Strasbourg that he comes to know Luther. And consequently, Luther takes him on as an assistant, and he translates a number of Luther's works into Latin, as well as publishing frequently in his own right. He's a professor of both Greek and Hebrew at Marburg, continuing a trend for focusing on scriptural languages in the Reformed education. So Lonecker is far less well known than Camerarius, but I think equally interesting in terms of working in the background on both classical texts and on Christian texts.
So you have these three figures, Melanchthon, Lonecker, and Camerarius, and in each case, their engagement with Greek tragedy influences the way in which they talk about Christian ethics in the present.
Yes, so both Lonecker and Camerarius published translations of Sophocles. So we've got Melanchthon lecturing on Sophocles and Lonecker and Camerarius writing translations, and in Camerarius' case also additions and commentaries as well, over quite an extended period. And so Camerarius' first Sophocles text comes out in 1534, and that is a commentary. And then he publishes translations of Ajax and Electra in 1556, but these become best known when they are appended to the Stephanus edition of 1568. So Camerarius talks about trying to get his editions out really quickly because there is someone in France publishing even faster than him, and he's got to get his stuff out. So this push to publish and academic pressure is there in the 16th century as much as it is now. And one of the ways he gets his work on Sophocles really well known is it is added to the big Stephanus edition of Sophocles of 1568.
Okay. Let's just take a moment to go back to something that we've touched on, and that's the Augsburg Confession, which was the great statement of Lutheran faith. Melanchthon was the prime mover in that, wasn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And what you see in the Augsburg Confession is a concern with these big themes of morality and leadership that I think are so important to reading Sophocles and then the New Testament in the light of Sophocles.
So you have, with Melanchthon and the others, you have an engagement with the classics which is going on at the same time as and is bleeding into their engagement with Christian theology in the present.
Yes. There's also an issue for Melanchthon, who is reforming the academic system, over who is it who's in charge of a university. Should a university be under state control or religious control? And who is it who is heading up an institution. And this gives you a chance to think about the relationship between the secular and the sacred, between education and theology. And Melanchthon's very carefully trying to position his work, and even in the creation of titles. So how you translate a term like tyrannos in Sophocles or Basileus in Sophocles' New Testament, and then how you use those words to give people titles in a university. What is a rector, for example, become really important to Melanchthon. Article 16 of the Augsburg Confession gives the point of this problem, the split between academic and religious leadership, because the Lutherans argue that Christians were free to serve in a secular state, and that states and vocations were part of God's natural order. And they want, therefore, there to be space for a secular vocation within a religious framework. And therefore, for Melanchthon, it's really important that you can differentiate between secular and sacred leadership. And this is there in the Augsburg Confession, and it's there in the way they handle their translation of the texts.
Okay. One thing that strikes me is the difference between the educational and intellectual environment of the 16th century and today. Because in the 16th century, evidently you could have someone like Melanchthon, who would have been raised on the classics and who would have read his Sophocles and Euripides and would have brought his engagement with the classics to his theology and to his work on the Bible. Whereas today, I think it's a forgivable generalization to say that New Testament studies, people who translate the Bible, people who work in those areas, tend not to be people who are coming from the perspective of a classical education.
I think that is broadly true. So one of the things you see happen is an increase in disciplinarity starting in the 18th century. So the Enlightenment brings with it both an increase in the amount of written material and academic positions and thinkers and all the rest of it that makes it hard to keep on top of everything in one go. You can't be a generalist in the same way, but also a disciplinary split between classics and theology in the UK. That split's much less evident in Germany. And actually, if you look at the German university structure nowadays, you'll find that you're much more likely to get theologians and classicists coexisting than you are in the UK. So I think your point holds for tertiary education in the UK and absolutely for secondary education more broadly. But actually, it's one of those places where there's quite an interesting split between Germany and the UK, because in Germany, there is still a good dialogue between the disciplines. And in the UK, those bridges are being rebuilt as interdisciplinarity becomes more of a theme. So in my faculty, for example, it used to be that I think probably the majority of graduate students were classicists moving into biblical studies. And now actually our New Testament students come from a huge variety of backgrounds and bring all of that disciplinarity with them. And classics and theology are talking to each other in new ways as a result. There's not an obvious or indeed one-way flow between them anymore.
Okay. Well, that sounds very encouraging. Let's turn now and look in more detail at the linguistic scholarship of Melanchthon and the others. What examples do we find of significant ways in which they translate particular terms in their texts?
One of my favourite examples is thinking about the setting of tragedies and the Bible. And what you get in the Ajax, which is the play they're all working on most, so Sophocles' Ajax, is a play set in front of a tent. And a tent in Greek is a skernere. And a skernere was originally a soldier's tent, and then it becomes a tent at the back of a theatre where the actors get changed. And then that becomes a building, and then Sophocles paints that building. Doesn't personally paint it, but Sophocles is known for introducing the idea of painting that building. And that's where we get the English scenery from. So that the skernere, the soldier's tent, gives us the scenery at the back of a theatre. that back of the theatre is usually meant to represent a palace. But what's interesting about the Ajax is it actually represents the soldier's tent that was the original Scarenair. So there's a kind of meta-theatrical twist to the Ajax, where the staging represents the Scarenair that was originally there. And I was looking at how Latin translations dealt with that. And they don't know whether to go with tentorium as a simple kind of tent thing, or castrum to make it into a camp. There are various kinds of problems over exactly what you do with that. And that Scarenair produces similar problems when you look at a text like the letter to the Hebrews. Because in Hebrews, a Scarenair refers to the tents that the pilgrim people are staying in, but also the tabernacle. And what you see in Hebrews is the language of pilgrimage brings in the language of camping and encampment. And that is fundamentally very theatrical and also very military. And you cannot avoid military and theatrical language in talking about pilgrimage and encampment in the letters to the Hebrews, where actually neither theatre nor the military are particularly relevant to reading that text. So when trying to translate the letter to the Hebrews into Latin, you're stuck with a word like Scarenair. You get the word Scarenair 10 times in the letter to the Hebrews. And Jerome and Erasmus always translate it as tabernaculum. So that military tent has become a sacred tabernacle. But when you look at other translations, it might be back to tentorium or castrum, preserving the purely military angle of the text. So you get this play of which cultural baggage am I going to invoke at this point? Am I going to invoke the spiritual baggage of we know it's a tabernacle, or the military baggage of we know it's a soldier's tent, or the theatrical baggage of actually this is something that has become a new cultural concept? So a really small example like that shows you how one word can point you in multiple different directions, and a translator's got to make a decision. And for me, this is where the topic of relevance theory comes in, that when you're first given a word like tent, do you immediately think of go outdoors and English camping situation, or do you immediately think of something else? What's the first and most relevant meaning of tent that comes to mind? And that is not the same through time or across languages.
And what would be an example of a characteristically Protestant way in which the translations of Melanchthon or Luther deal with their texts?
I think morality shows it most obviously. So what you find is hubris, for example, is a word which means kind of transgression and insult in some kind of way. And hubris is a term that you get 14 times in the Ajax, and it's translated by words like insulto or contumelia. Insulto obviously gives us our English insult. Contumelia gives us contumely, which is a much less obvious word. But we've got those two branches of a kind of physical insult or more of a moral harm. Hubris occurs just 10 times in the New Testament in various forms. So it's a nice small case study and allows us to look at what might be going on with a particular kind of wrongdoing. And you find it translated by contumelia or inuria, and once as flagella bitter. In the Vulgate, contumelia and contumeliosus occur a further 7 times, only translating forms of atimia, and atimia means dishonor. So hubris and atimia are linked in the Vulgate understanding of wrongdoing. So it's injustice, and hubris is therefore a form of injustice. And inuria, which is used to translate hubris, also translates adichia, another form of injustice. So injustice and dishonor are very much the understanding of hubris. But then when you start reading the later translations, it's things like forms of mastics, or flagello, it's a much more physical form. And it looks like the moral form of hubris is lost to a physical one. And if you're reading the New Testament with Sophocles in mind, it's far harder to reconcile the moral and physical aspects of hubris. And what you see is some kind of split between those moral and physical forms of bad behaviour. And I think Luther's trying to work out what sin and wrongdoing actually mean. And a term like hubris allows him to make a difference between physical and moral wrongdoing. And it's that kind of rethinking of the relationship between good and bad behaviour and intellectual and moral behaviour that I think you see develop in various kinds of words for wrongdoing. And I think one of the ways of looking at this is actually to flip it round and look at positive terms. And the one I tend to use is sophrosine, which is a kind of good behaviour. It's not an easy term to translate, but it's about being positively behaved. And in the New Testament, you get that as modestus, prudens, prudentia, sobrius, sobrietate, sana mente. Sana mente only occurs in Mark 5:15 and Luke 8:35, translating the only two uses of the participle sophronunta in the New Testament. So being of sound mind is very much that active process conveyed by the participle in the New Testament. Modestus is used 5 more times in the Vulgate, translating a variety of terms. So modestus doesn't seem to be a particular kind of characteristic. All uses of sobrietas in the Vulgate are accounted for by parts of sophrone, but the adjective sobrius occurs a further 10 times in the Vulgate, translating Greek drunkenness terms. So sobrius as a form of good behaviour is quite closely linked with being sophrone. Prudens only translates sophrone in Titus and 1 Peter, but elsewhere it translates wisdom and understanding. So good behaviour is seen as wisdom and understanding. In Erasmus and Luther's translations, though, all uses of prudens are removed. They don't use prudens. So the Vulgate's got prudens, this kind of idea of sobriety and good sense being linked, and that's lost in Erasmus and Luther. Erasmus uses modestus twice, but Luther uses it 11 times. And at 1 Timothy 2:9 and 2:15, when referring to women's behaviour, Erasmus uses castitas, where the Vulgate uses sobrietas, and Luther modestia. And I think that's quite neat because castitas is used in the Vulgate, but not here. So Erasmus has given women's good behaviour a very gendered form of chastity. The Vulgate's gone with sobriety, which we've seen had already linked up with its ideas of good sense. And Luther's completely flattened that out and just gone for modestia, a much more flattened, generalised state of modesty, undefined and ungendered. So where the Vulgate has got something that's linking to good sense, Erasmus genders it and Luther ungenders it again and flattens it out. And I think that's quite a neat example of Luther working out a kind of moral philosophy in progress.
Okay. That's interesting. And that, I'm afraid, is where we'll have to leave it for this episode, as we're out of time for today. Dr. Cressida Ryan, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.